Hi all, welcome to week 2 of our class, the Episcopal Church in America. In my first lecture for this week, I am again using the word matters as a noun. My remarks will be historical in nature. I want to expand on Hatchett's brief paragraph about the production of the first American prayer book on pages 9 and 10 of his commentary. There, Hatchett writes, quote, "The possibility of making a revision to the Book of Common Prayer that would find general acceptance in the newly independent United States was complicated not only by liturgical and theological issues, but also by political and personal enmities." That's on page 9. Let me start by detailing the liturgical and theological issues that Hatchett has in mind. The 1662 prayer book had been, since the time of the Restoration under Charles II, the bond of union among Anglicans. Even though there had been numerous proposals for its revision, almost before the ink was dried, and many differences in actual practice, it had served as a unifying function for over a century. The newly independent church in America presented a threat to that union. While some American Episcopalians wished only to reprint the 1662 prayer book with no alterations except those that were made necessary by the changed political situation, others wanted to use the occasion to pursue wholesale revisions to the 1662 prayer book. Americans knew that within their ranks there were those who wanted to excise elements that had long been offensive to Puritans. For example, the word priest, for which minister would be substituted. There were those who were emboldened by the changes to the prayer book that Wesley's followers, who had separated from Anglicanism, were making. There were those who were emboldened by changes to the prayer book that Unitarians, sometimes referred to anachronistically as Arians, were making, which eliminated references to the Trinity and addressed all prayers to God the Father alone. There were those who recognized that deism was in ascendancy, and the prayer book needed to reflect that. There were those who were aware of revisions that the non-jurors in England and some Episcopalians in Scotland had incorporated, particularly to Eucharistic prayers. There were those who were sympathetic to the latitudinarians, who called for relief from the subscription to the 39 Articles, which of course Roman Catholics or dissenters or nonconformists couldn't subscribe to. There were those who knew about the work of the so-called liturgical archaeologists, who had a high regard for Christian liturgies of the Eastern Church, and who had published and used in small groups rites based on Eastern models. By the way, you see Hatchett engaged in just that sort of liturgical archaeology throughout his commentary, when he refers to, for example, medieval Roman Catholic precursors to elements that we find in the present Book of Common Prayer. Those liturgical and theological issues suggested that there had to be a revision, but a revision that would find general acceptance at this particular period in the early 1780s seemed almost hopeless. But just as there were liturgical and theological issues at stake, Hatchett, as you remember, points out that there were political and personal enmities. The ethos within which the revisers worked was predominantly Protestant, as I tried to illustrate in my lectures last week when talking about the religious sensibilities in the various colonies. That sounds like a religious characterization, but it's also a political one. You will recall that the Episcopal Church was associated in the minds of most people after the Revolution with two undemocratic institutions. First, the crown, the monarch, and two, state-supported episcopacy. But the church no longer had support of the states. Tensions between the now defeated Tory loyalists and patriots continued to exist. There were divisions between those Episcopalians who continued to take their cues from the Church of England and those who, in light of Seabury's consecration, looked to the Episcopal Church in Scotland. But, as I mentioned last week, there were also doubts by some concerning the validity of Seabury's consecration. That complicated matters. And the fact that Seabury signed some of his early letters with Bishop of all America in imitation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was in fact the primate of all England, as well as certain aspects of his conduct which were grating, which conformed to the loftiness of the title he assumed for himself. Those things certainly didn't help to create an atmosphere for a cooperative enterprise. Moreover, the would-be revisers lived on the edge of a great Western expansion in the early 1780s, and they faced the need for the church to adapt itself to missionary opportunities, to challenges posed by those missionary opportunities. And you will recall, too, that I suggested last week that the situation after the Revolution favored pluralism. Lay voices grew in volume. Many of you have touched on that in your comments in the discussion this past week. You also commented on something that is equally true, and that is that vestries assume to themselves greater and greater power. And so then, as folks began to consider the possibility of revising the English prayer book of 1662, they were caught on two prongs of a dilemma. A radical revision of the 1662 prayer book, or a failure to revise anything more than the state prayers. Either one would have splintered the church and dissolved any hope of unity on American soil. I'll say that one more time. Two prongs of the dilemma. A radical revision of the 1662 prayer book or a failure to revise anything more than the state prayers would have splintered the church and dissolved any hope of unity on American soil. I'll turn to a description of the results and what matters as a verb about worship in part 2 of this lecture.